Hey students, welcome back, and this is chapter 4, part 2. Just as a heads up, I also am adding an additional PowerPoint to this chapter, which is a shorter PowerPoint that you'll find right after this chapter. This is just some additional supplemental information, and you can also find that information in chapter 4 of your text. So we're still talking about the gold rush, and in this one we are going to talk about the different types of mining, what mining camps were like in California, and then finally we're going to talk about how California enters the Union. So we're going to address the California Constitutional Convention. So the lecture questions for this lecture are: what types of mining took place during the gold rush? Number 2, what was mining camp life like in California during the gold rush? And finally, what is the California Constitutional Convention and how did it impact the state? So here are our key terms for this lecture. And again, we are primarily talking about the gold rush. We are talking about the ways in which the state changed. And we will also be talking about that in part 3 of this lecture. So once the gold rush began, there were different types of mining that took place in California. The very first type of mining that took place was placer mining. This is the type of mining that you often think of when you think of the miner 49er who's going out there with his mining pan and sifting through the sediment at the bottom of the creek or river. And this was the most common type because it was the easiest, and an individual, if they were lucky, could get very rich this way if they happened to find, decent sized nuggets. And so this was, like I said, the first type of mining that took place. Now, of course, you need some equipment for this. You need really kind of just a shovel and the mining pan. And so, people like Sam Brannan, who ran through the streets of San Francisco yelling, "Gold, gold," he made sure that he had a whole stockpile of those pans and shovels and picks and all of those things before he went and did that, so that he could sell them to the miners for a premium. So the placer mining, the first type, also the type of mining in California that was lasted the least longest, because all of the surface gold in California was essentially gone after the first 2 years of the gold rush, because people had gone in and just kind of picked it clean. So then you also have the cradles, or the long toms, or the sloughs, as they were sometimes referred to. And this is also a type of placer mining, but it's done on a much larger level. So you're creating major water diversions in order to get to those gold nuggets in the sediment at the bottom of the river or the stream. And I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute of what those cradles or long toms and sloughs look like. Then there's the hard rock mining. This particular type of mining requires major equipment, because this is when you're going down into the actual earth. You're creating mining shafts, you're taking the rock out of the mining shafts, and then you are processing it through the stamp method, where you're stamping out the rock, and then you're trying to extract the gold ore. And this was actually pretty devastating on the environment, because you did have to use different types of chemicals, heavy pollutants, mercury, to extract the actual gold ore from the rock. And these pollutants, of course, as they're going through the process, are then being washed into the ground and into the waterways, etc. So hard rock mining will eventually become, hard rock and hydraulic, which I'm going to talk about next, will become the two major ways that mining operations will move forward after 1860. because, as I said, basically the surface metal, the surface gold is essentially going to be gone after the first several years of the gold rush. Okay, so hard rock mining, again, you're digging into the earth, you're going down into mining shafts, and you're extracting that gold. The second major way that it was done after a while was hydraulic mining, and this is extremely devastating to the environment. You basically have a giant water hose and you blast it on the side of a hill, trying to uncover veins of gold. And you can actually still see the scars from some of this hydraulic mining that was done during the gold rush up in the gold country. You can look at the side of hillsides, and the vegetation never grew back completely. So it's not only does it sort of destroy the actual landscape, but it's also creating a side effect, which is the sediment that is falling down from these mountainsides and then again getting washed into waterways. And keep in mind that California had a lot of free-flowing waterways at this time. This was before the time of, massive dammings and things like that. So lots of rivers and streams and things flowing in the state. And they had fish in them. Some of them even had salmon in them. And so they're now suffering from this lack of oxygen in the water because the silt and everything. Okay, so that's hydraulic mining. And again, I'm going to show pictures in a minute. And then the final type of mining, and this was really sort of like a last-ditch effort to recover as much gold as possible, was dredging, sorry. And dredging was done beginning in the 1890s. And this was where you would take those rivers and streams that had been downstream from the gold mining operations, and you actually used a dredge to try to get whatever gold might have escaped down the river at the bottom of these rivers downstream. And so those were, that was again sort of a last-ditch effort, but it required heavy equipment. And so what you see happening is that over time, basically, the miners who had originally come to try to find gold on their own, many of them, will become the wage earners for these hard rock mining companies, the hydraulic mining companies, the dredging mining companies, right? And so they become kind of like these working stiffs who, are working for these bigger companies. Now, obviously, when these mining operations become very large, they become very devastating on the environment, right? You have a disruption of wildlife with, loss of habitat, and also with the streams being filled with toxins and pollutants. Lots of toxins in the waterways, as I've already mentioned. You have hillsides being, blasted away by the hydraulic mining hoses. And you also have deforestation that's happening at a pretty rapid rate during the time of the gold rush, because people are going, chopping down trees in order to build housing and businesses and towns, etc. So again, that's another loss of habitat for wildlife. So major changes to the environment taking place as a result of these mining operations. So let's look at some images. So this first image that you're looking at here is pretty remarkable. This is actually a full-on diversion of what looks to be like a river. And you can see how they've basically created on the right-hand side this long tom slough, which is taking the sediment from the river and actually sifting through it to try to find the gold. At the same time, you've got the miners here where the riverbed once was, kind of sifting through the bottom of the riverbed to try to find gold there as well. So quite incredible work, a feat of engineering there, I would have to say. Okay, next slide. So again, here's another example of a slough, little smaller scale than the one that we just saw in the last image, but you're looking still same type of idea. You're looking for the water to wash away the other types of sediment and for the gold to kind of land at the bottom, right? The heavier metal. Okay, next. So here you go. This is hydraulic mining, and you can see here how entire, hillsides are essentially being washed away as a result of this hydraulic mining process. And you can see the big hoses there blasting into the hillside. Okay, so now we're going to talk about mining claims, and this is what basically the way that people operated in the early days of the gold rush. If you wanted to come out to California and you wanted to stake a claim, basically what you would do is you would go to an area that you thought might be promising with its gold deposits, and you would set up a camp, and you would have your tools, and you would basically actively work that claim on a daily basis. And that was how you staked a claim. And so it was as simple as that. Now, you always ran the risk that somebody might jump your claim. And this was basically when somebody would come along, maybe they were better armed than you were, or, maybe they had more people with them or whatever, and they basically took your claim from you either through brute force or basically by just kind of sneaking in. And so this was a problem in a lot of areas. And then there was a lot of, sort of bullying going on in this process. There were some alcaldes, which are the sheriffs left over from the Spanish and Mexican period, that were put in charge in some areas for settling these disputes. But in most cases, these disputes would be settled through frontier justice, which was basically, whoever won, won. And there was typically a lot of violence involved. And we're actually going to talk about later in this lecture Joaquin Marietta, who was, famously had his mining claim jumped, and a series of horrible things happened to him after that led him to basically become this famous legendary outlaw during this period of California history. Next slide. So San Francisco is going to be the place that is going to be most transformed, at least immediately, from the onset of the gold rush. You can see here is a very old picture of San Francisco, not a picture, but an image of San Francisco from around 1848. And under the Spanish and Mexican rule, it was called the city of Yerba Buena. It becomes San Francisco sort of during this transitional process here when California was entering into the gold rush. So you look here, very small little city, little town really on a hill. You can see the sort of natural port that was there on the coastline. That's what made it attractive to the Spanish. But there was only 200 people there in 1848. By the time we get to 1852, there are 36,000 people. By the time we get to 1870, there are 150,000 people, including at least by 1852, 25,000 Chinese immigrants that had come to work in the gold fields. By the time it's all said and done, you've got about 300,000 people who are going to come to the city of San Francisco. So look at the transformation over time, and you can see that, there's boats are now in the harbor. There's buildings that are popping up everywhere. Again, buildings requiring wood to build them. So lots of logging happening at the same time. Keep that in mind. And then you notice the ships in this image. This becomes kind of iconic of San Francisco during this time period where people would famously, sail their ships into San Francisco harbor and then abandon them for the gold fields. Because, keep in mind, San Francisco is still quite some distance from the Sierra Nevada, which is where the most of the gold mining was taking place. And so people would abandon their ships here in the harbor of San Francisco, and then they would take these ferries up the river, like the San Francisco Delta, till they got to Sacramento, and from there they would get off and take a horse or whatever up into the mining fields. So they would just abandon their ships here, and pretty soon it got to be so many ships in the San Francisco harbor that they decided to scuttle the ships to make more land. So they basically sunk the ships in the harbor, and then they filled the top of the ships with landfill to create more land. And that's one of the reasons why in the San Francisco earthquake of 1989, the Marina District got hit especially hard, because those houses were actually built on top of the landfill that was created during the gold rush era from all of these scuttled ships. So it's a very diverse city too, and we're going to talk more about how that happens. And I already mentioned that the Chinese immigrants were coming in. So we're now going to talk about where the gold went. Where did the gold go? There's lots of gold coming out of the city during this time period. Most of it, interestingly, is going to purchase entertainment, purchase goods. People basically, want to, they're out here in this area, it's unfamiliar to them. And if you found a piece of gold, you might go and exchange it, and basically you'd get it weighed and you'd get it valued, and then you would be able to go out and entertain yourself either at the saloon or maybe at the bar. Maybe you would want to buy some new, clothing or new boots or some new tools, etc. So there was lots of ways that you could buy things, and as I mentioned, the merchants were really making a killing because things were very expensive in Gold Rush, California. Sometimes the gold would actually leave California, because traders would come to California and they would have ships laden with all types of goods from the East Coast or from other parts of the world, and that would be exchanged as well. So the gold was leaving California and going elsewhere. Banks begin to pop up around California, and at these banks you could then exchange the gold for currency. Some of the people that came to the gold rush, they left after a while, because maybe they were smart and they said, you know what, I'm not going to spend all my money. I'm not going to spend all this gold. I'm going to go, take it home and not blow it on entertainment at the saloon or whatever. So some of them would bring it home with them. Or some of them would maybe exchange it for paper money and then send it back home to their families. In 1854, there was a mint that was established in San Francisco specifically for minting gold, coins, mostly gold coins. There's no longer actually an operating mint in San Francisco today, but there is still the facilities there, and sometimes they do make commemorative coins and things like that. But at this time, it's actually pumping out real gold currency. So you can see on the slide $100 billion worth of gold just in the first 25 years of the gold rush, and that would be about $100 billion now. So huge amounts of money. The other thing to keep in mind is that there's California, when the American Civil War breaks out in 1861, which is, of course, just 10 years basically after the gold rush started, sides with the Union. And this becomes really critical for the Union because the gold from California is going to be put to help supply troops, to help build weapons, to help build up the Navy, all the things that helped the Union win the Civil War. Next. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about mining camps, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we will talk more about this when we get to the gold rush, the bigger lectures specifically focusing on the gold rush. But, I mean, as you can imagine, camp life, it's these mining camps were very impromptu, right? So sometimes they didn't have a very good laid out structure. And they were really rough places. I mean, you had people coming from all over the world to these mining camps, and so you had people from, Mexico, you had people from Latin America, specifically like Chile and Peru. There was a lot of miners from there that came up to join in these California mining camps. Lots of Australian miners coming across the Pacific. People from China, as I mentioned, the Chinese coming in, there was about 25,000 at first, and then 300,000 altogether that came over for the California Gold Rush and also to help build the Transcontinental Railroad. You had Hawaiians, people coming over from Hawaii, that were also actively engaged in mining. And there was a lot of mixing of different types of cultures. There was a lot of kind of interesting gender role reversals because there was very few women. Women definitely had some negotiating power because they were seen as being, valuable because they could cook, they could clean, they could take care of the camp, they could sometimes offer nursing services. They were seen as being some of the most valuable members of the mining camp community. Some women in California gold rush mining camps became very rich because they could sell their goods at a premium. And so just to give you an example of the type of the price inflation that existed in these mining camps, I mean, you're talking about like $2 for a single egg. I mean, that's expensive for today's prices, right? So prices were very much inflated. So you also have entertainment that's taking place in these mining camps in the saloons. Prostitution, of course, was also another thing that was happening, and women oftentimes would run brothels. And again, if you were the brothel owner, at least you would be able to make quite a bit of money. Boarding houses were another thing that were sometimes run by women, restaurants as well. But the environment of these camps were very dirty. There was a lot of sort of disease and sickness that went around. There and justice was very well. It was really non-existent. It was really sort of frontier justice, and it was carried out by vigilante committees who would oftentimes, do horrible punishments, things like, of course, public hangings. Like there's a place um, up in the Gold Rush country known as Hangtown, right? And that's because that's where there was a bunch of hangings that took place. Placerville is the name of it, but it's also called Hangtown. Um, so hanging, of course, was very common. There was also humiliating punishments such as the shaving of the head or cutting off noses and fingers. Sometimes branding would take place, mutilation, public beatings, all of this stuff. So it was a very sort of rough place to live, and there was a lot of interesting dynamics between the people that lived within the mining towns. So here are some images. So you can see in the image on the left, you can see that, women did sometimes participate in the mining, but usually they were offering sort of these more support services. You're seeing there a picture of a group of French miners. So people came from as far as Europe to come to the California gold fields. And then here on the lower right, you can see here's a group of what looks like some kind of Anglo miners there on the left. Perhaps they're American, maybe they're European. And then you can see the Chinese miners on the right there. So there was a lot of nativism and racism that starts to emerge in these camps. Some of it was kind of people would do it opportunistically. So, for example, if a Mexican miner had a particularly good claim, an Anglo miner might come along and try to take that claim from that miner. There was a lot of prejudice against people, anybody of color, and also sometimes of Catholics. This was really before a lot of Catholics had um, immigrated into the United States. So we get a big influx of Catholic immigrants at the turn of the 20th century, but at this time, Catholics were still seen sort of as a minority. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of South Americans that are also coming in, French people, which would have been Catholic for the most part, would have also been in the category of people that might have faced discrimination. There was a lot of newcomers from America, right? The Argonauts, as they were often referred to, these people that would travel either overland or by boat to come to California for the gold rush. And they would oftentimes resent the expertise of the Sonoran miners or the Native American miners. And so there were some laws that were passed to try to prevent or at least give the Anglo miners an advantage, right? So they decided to pass a tax called the Foreign Miners Tax, or the Miners Tax of 1850. So this was a tax put on people who were actively mining a claim of $20 a month if you were a non-citizen. And by non-citizen, that meant that you were not an American citizen, right? Because remember, California is admitted into the Union as a state in 1850. So this was a tax of $20 a month. Now, that doesn't sound like maybe a lot to us today, but if you translate that into today's money, that would translate to $500 a month. So this was still quite a bit of money for most people, and it put a real burden on these non-citizen miners. And what ends up happening is a lot of them just stop mining and start doing other things. But this was causing a drag on the economy. So they decided to change the law after 2 years and lowered the foreign miners tax from $20 a month to $4 a month. And this happened in 1852. Now, this was still a lot of money for people because $4 would be equivalent to about $100, right, today in today's money. But it was still, something that was not quite as much of a burden. So it did help some people, and you started to see more of an increase in people being able to mine after 1852 when the tax was lowered. Um, but a lot of the merchants and people who relied upon these miners to come and boost the economy began to complain. And so in 1855, basically they got rid of most of the mining taxes by exempting all people who intended on becoming citizens. Now, that was still going to be a problem, for example, the Chinese miners who were exempt from ever becoming citizens. So they had been explicitly exempt. So they would have still had to pay the tax after 1855. But again, this was really meant to advantage the American miners, right? The people, the Argonauts, the people who were coming overland to California. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a very sort of famous, legendary figure from California Gold Rush history, Joaquin Marietta. So Joaquin Marietta, and again, this is kind of just a legend, right? We don't really know if we know that there was a lot of outlaws um, that emerged in the California Gold Rush era. But so he was a Sonoran miner who came up from Mexico to California to, find a fortune in the gold rush. And he came with his family. He brought his wife and he brought his brother. And the legend goes that Joaquin Murrieta had a claim in a southern mine in southern California, and that his claim was jumped. And his claim was jumped by a group of Anglo miners, American miners. And in sort of at the same time that his claim was jumped, a bunch of violent acts were committed against his family. His brother was lynched. His wife was raped and murdered. And so legend has it that after these horrific things happened to Joaquin Murrieta, he runs off into the wilderness basically and becomes an outlaw. And he starts committing all of these violent acts, attacking Anglo mining camps. He starts to steal horses off of ranches, etc. So there's a bounty put on his head of $1,000, and a group of California Rangers who were modeled basically after the Texas Rangers out in Texas went out to go try to collect the bounty on Murrieta, and they were basically hunting for him. And in 1853, a captain of the California Rangers, a man by the name of Henry Love, claimed to have killed Murrieta and cut off his head. Now there's a lot of sort of speculation about this. Was the person that he killed? He definitely killed somebody and definitely cut off his head. But was it the true Joaquin Murrieta? Many people doubt that it was. In fact, a lot of people think that Joaquin managed to escape California and get back into Mexico. But so there was this big sort of public display of Joaquin Murrieta. So his head was actually put on display in a jar, and people would go and pay $1 to see the head of this famous outlaw at the Stockton House. As you can see, if you look on the left, you see the flyer for it. Come and see the head of Joaquin Murrieta and pay $1. And on the right, you see there pictured Captain Harry Love, the guy who claimed to have killed Murrieta in 1853. Little interesting side story is that Murrieta's sister has reported to have come and seen the head and walked away saying that this definitely was not Joaquin. So we still don't know if this was indeed the head of Joaquin Murrieta, but I think it shows an important thing about the tension in California gold rush, and also the fact that there was a lot of violence, right, happening, and a lot of almost vigilante style justice, where Murrieta did not have an opportunity to have a day in court. He was just simply hunted down, killed, and then this captain collects the bounty, and and everybody agrees that, okay, yes, that's his head. So okay, next slide. Okay, so California, prior to becoming a state, needed to create a constitution. And so a group convenes in Monterey at Colton Hall, which you see pictured there, in 1848 to figure out what the state constitution would look like. There were 48 delegates that attended this constitutional convention, and it was a very mixed group of people. I mean, comparatively, if you compare it to other states in the United States, this was a very diverse group of people. You have Californios, right, many of whom didn't even speak English, attending this convention. you have some foreign-born Europeans, many of whom had become, some of the upper class members of California society. Even before the Mexican-American War, you had people that had come to California and settled there, and they were European. Um, and then you had, of course, a group of Americans that were also at this constitutional convention. It was translators were there at the convention to translate for the people that didn't speak English, most of them being the Californios. Um, and what did they do at the convention? Well, some of the important things that they did, and they did a lot more than what I've listed out here, but these are some of the more interesting things I think that they did at the um, Constitutional Convention of 1848. They created the eastern boundary of the state. So the eastern boundary of the state had not yet really been defined. There was some talk that maybe the eastern boundary of the state could go just right down the ridge of the Sierra Nevada, but it was decided that instead the eastern boundary of the state would go on the other side of the Sierra Nevada, basically so that California would swallow up the entire mountain range. And of course, some of this decision was being made because of the gold rush, right? California wanted to claim as much of that gold country as they possibly could. The other thing that they decided in this constitutional convention was that California would be a bilingual state, speaking both English and Spanish, and that all laws and all official documents in the state would be created in both English and Spanish. That actually will remain the official law until 1879, when California has a second constitutional convention to revise their constitution. So for, several decades, California was officially a bilingual state. Another thing that was put into the California Constitution was community property laws for women. And again, I've mentioned before how unusual this was for a state in the United States, in America, to have any kind of laws protecting the rights of women. And in this particular case, they decided to write that into the Constitution. It was a carryover from the Spanish and Mexican period. So community property, meaning women who came into a marriage already owning property, would still be able to own that property. And if a woman married a man with property, if they happened to get divorced, that she would be able to get half of that property. That is still something that is true today in the state of California. And again, it's a real carryover and a real empowerment, I think, for women in the state. They did vote unanimously to not have slavery in the first iteration, anyway, of the California Constitution. This actually is a little bit misleading because even though they did want to come into the Union as a free state, as time moves on and more Southerners actually move to Southern California, there's talk that they actually wanted to create a split California, with the southern part of California being a slave state, which is really sort of strange. And in fact, they were actually gonna vote on that prior to the outbreak of the American Civil War, but because the American Civil War broke out, it never did happen. But anyway, for now in 1848, these delegates did vote unanimously for California to exclude slavery. And then in a particularly sort of, I don't know, harsh and I guess telling of how discriminating a lot of these people were, the wording in the Constitution specifically excluded African Americans and Native Americans from voting. And voting was limited to white male citizens. And they did include white male citizens. They did include Californios in that category. So Californios would have been considered white male citizens. There's also no property requirement for voting in the state of California either, but it did specifically exclude African Americans, Native Americans, and women too, because women were also excluded from voting. Okay, next slide. So what happens to the Californios after 1850 and its entry into the United States as a state? So when California became a state in 1850, there were about 10,000 Mexicans and Hispanicized Indians living in California. And of course, these are the people who were there during the Spanish period, during the Mexican period. Unfortunately for this group of people, over time, they are going to lose a lot of their political power, their land, and their economic standing. And what you're starting to see is, even though the Californios could vote, and that was established as long as they were male Californios, they could vote, and that was established in the Constitution, you're going to start to see some laws that specifically target the California population. In 1855, the state legislature passed two laws. One was a Sunday law, and the other was something called the Greaser Law, which was kind of like a vagrancy law. So I'll begin with the Sunday law. The Sunday law was aimed at trying to stop people from having massive celebrations and gatherings on Sunday, which was something that was so integral to the part of um, California life, right? Californios had for a very long time, gathered in these big fandangos and these big fiestas, celebrations, where they would come together and have these community gatherings. And a lot of times that happened on Sunday. So this was really aimed at trying to prevent that from happening. And then the second one, the Greaser Law, was like a vagrancy law. So, you could basically target people if they were loitering around or if they were hanging out too long in public areas. And really, I mean, these laws are meant to, they act like they're trying to um, stop people from being basically like homeless. But really, what the laws are intended to do is to empower law enforcement to basically racially profile people and go out and target them for harassment. And so these two laws, both of them passed in 1855, seemed like they were really specifically aimed at restricting the freedoms of Californios.